I would like to say a few words about general semantics as a term to begin with, kind of index that term. Uh, my intention this weekend, and what have been asked to do, is to present what we might call general semantics sub-zero, GS sub-zero. And I don't want to use that in the sense of null, as Van Vogt uses it in the worlds of null A, an unfortunate extension of general semantics. You know, when Krzyzewski used the term non-Aristotelian, he meant primarily not or beyond the Aristotelian dispensation, but fully recognizing that a lot of what Aristotle was talking about, or Aristotelian modes, are quite legitimate, but in a restricted way. That non-Aristotelian is not anti-Aristotelian. Van Vogt, unfortunately, it seems to be, by using the term null A, setting up all kinds of images of the empty set, suggests that what general semantics is about is a kind of a nothing with relation to Aristotle, and indeed that is not the case, as anyone who has read Science and Sanity knows. So I just say that as a warning. When I use GS sub-zero, I'm using simply the zero as the kind of the ultimate sort of starting point in a casual sense. What I'm going to be talking about primarily this weekend are the formulations of Alfred Korzybski, because it's my conviction that in the field of general semantics, those formulations are still the most sturdy, the most scientifically acceptable, and those formulations that are most likely, if we internalize them, to make some changes for us in the way we see things, and the way we evaluate, and so on. We might talk about GS sub 1, and we might consider that the first generation of popularizations of general semantics. And we would be concerned with here with names like Chase, Hayakawa. Has anyone dated Hayakawa lately?
Constantly.
No accounting for taste. Yeah. Date Hayakawa. Hayakawa 1979 is obviously not Hayakawa 1941. And if we're really into general semantics, we internalize that, we recognize that, and it makes a difference in our responses. We don't throw out the valuable things in Hayakawa's book, which I can't recall immediately. We're going to say a bit about Hayakawa because there are problems with relation to general semantics formulations, specifically related to the ladder of abstracting, so-called, or ladder of abstraction. We'll talk about that later. But just as a starter, I want to remind you that as Californians particularly, most of you seem to be Californians, I base that on your applications, not on your appearance or anything that I've been able to detect, in this environment. But datum. There are many, many Hayakawas, as there are many, many of each one of us. All right, so for the first generation, we're talking about Hayakawa and Johnson and Lee and some others. We will make some references to those because particularly with relation to Hayakawa, I have a feeling that a lot of misevaluating has occurred with relation to the so-called abstraction ladder. But we'll do that in a way which will not be a personal attack on Hayakawa, but simply a necessary correction for some formulational fudge. Fudge is easy to come by when we start formulating. It's tough to be rigorous. GS2 we can call the movement. In nomine Patri, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. I grew up that way. And it makes a difference to me that, in fact, it's a lesson, that while the Pope, who's also Polish, is on the East Coast and points in between talking to millions, I'm on the West Coast talking to 40. And I think there's a lesson in that for people who are interested in general semantics. The Pope, obviously a marvelous guy. I mean, you know. But the Pope is presenting a system of belief. And he's saying, in effect, your responsibility with relation to me is to believe what I'm saying with relation to our interpretation of Jesus Christ and so forth. And this has nothing to do with his splendor as a person, although probably his splendor as a person is going to make a big impact on a lot of people who might have been thinking agnostically and so forth. My job, much more modest and reflected in the modesty of the audience here, and it's important that we don't kid ourselves about that. We have to recognize that we constitute a very small minority of thinking people on the planet Earth. My job, as I see it this weekend, is to present some aspects of a system of evaluation, which means the responsibility is yours as well as mine. I sincerely hope, in fact, I will impose on you that you not believe anything that I say. I'm very sincere about anything that I say, but you'd better not believe any of it. And your job is to simply listen, cock your ear-brain system, say, maybe. And then try it, think about it, mull it over, and maybe you'll find something within this weekend. Maybe you'll find one or two things that turn out to be useful for you. That's not bad for $75. You know, think about a lot of your past weekends. Well, etc. I don't want to go any more into this indexing. I think that's enough to indicate the bias that I'll be operating from. All I claim to be able to do is to talk about Korzybski in a fairly rigorous way, in a way that indicates that I've read some of his stuff, but I'm not going to say the St. Paul thing, that it is not I who speak, but Korzybski who speaks through me. It will always be I who speak. And if you want to check out the Korzybski, you have to look into Korzybski's formulations. Speaking of which, I would like to recommend that if any of you have brought any reading material with you, which we did not, I believe in the announcement, suggest, but I would like to suggest, at least for starters, that you read in Selections from Science and Sanity, any of those that have it with you. And it just happens that Russ Joyner has brought some with him from up north in San Francisco. The sections on abstracting and on the structural differential. These are at the heart of general semantics formulations, and in the short time that we have here at a weekend seminar, I really could not expect you to do any more reading than that, especially in such a seductive environment. I hope that you're also serious enough to do some work and to some thinking about what we're talking about, and that being the case, I would like you to read in Selections from Science and Sanity, Chapter 12 on abstracting, which starts on page 166, and 13 on the structural differential, which begins on page 180. I'll put that up on the board for you. I'll just put the page references. 166 and 180. Those two chapters that are cheek by jowl. Now, what I would like to do this evening, and again, the first part of what we're doing is we're going to be very much related to, well, people often say, well, if a person internalizes general semantics, what would he be like? Well, of course, the first answer ought to be that he wouldn't be like anything you ever saw, and that all the people who have done that would be different from each other. But it seems to me one thing that they ought to have been able to achieve is a certain amount of flexibility and accommodation. That as situations come up which were not anticipated, because we operate on the basis of minimum expectations, that if something comes after that's really a kind of a wrencher, that the person who has internalized some general semantics ought to be able to deal with that. Well, I almost never present myself as a case study because I consider that egotistical, arrogant, and a sure way to failure. Because I don't do all that well. But tonight, it just happened that a few hours before I just had to make a dinner engagement, I opened up my suitcase and took a look at my machine, and you see it right here. That's about the state in which I found it. Only some parts were loose, and the motor wasn't attached properly to the battery, and it wouldn't run. What am I going to do? Have a nervous breakdown? Maybe. But I'm stressing this, and I'm being very open about it, because it seems to me that this is what, or one of the things that we're concerned about in general semantics. We have our heads full of these maps, and we interact with the territory, and very often the territory does not meet our expectations. It doesn't fit the map, and we very often have a tendency to reject the territory. So what I'm going to encourage you to do is to suspend that rejection. Have a delayed response. If you can do it, you're already very much into general semantics. And if you can do it without saying, what the hell kind of a feather merchant is this? You know, I read this stuff. Pula does this, and Pula does that, and all that. And, you know, he may be assistant to the Pope in disguise. You know, and I paid my 75 plus transportation costs, a room. Whew. You know, I come here for free. I even get a fee, which is a little bit embarrassing to me. I've always had a little trouble with this kind of interaction with other human beings. How come is it, and that's another thing I think we should consider this weekend, how come is it that one human being should presume to stand up in front of 30 or 40 or even 100 or in many cases 1,000 others and speak? And why do you sit there? What mechanisms are acting or are involved here? And I think we should be very much concerned with that throughout this weekend. All right, one thing I will do as part of what I hope to do, I want to generate a little bit of shared experience. I know this is a very sophisticated audience. Many of you have read a lot of general semantics. Many of you are teachers of general semantics. Some of you are officials in general semantics organizations. Some of you have even, and I still can't explain this to myself, have witnessed seminars conducted by me before, and you came to this one anyway. And that's something I think we both have to deal with during this 3-day period. What are we up to? But for starters, we should have some shared experiences. We should have some things where whatever you bring to this seminar, we could forget that with all of your sophistication, and you can say, well, at least I saw this particular thing, and you saw it, and you saw it, and you saw it, and we had this kind of experience, and then we talked about that. A lot of the popular literature in general semantics, and I won't footnote that either, because I'm a gentle person, suggests that once you become aware of these disparities between expectations and what's really going on and all that sort of good stuff, that this will make such a profound difference that your whole life will be turned around. And what I would like to stress this weekend is that experientially, operationally, that's a lot of hogwash. You cannot expect lifetime internalized neurochemical, neurophysiological responses to be turned around within a very short amount of time. This stuff that gets in early really gets in. And if you're going to kid yourself that within a weekend or a few seminars or 10 years of reading Science and Sanity or whatever you're reading, that you're going to overcome all of this early programming, you're playing a fool's game. Consciousness of abstracting. The awareness is all. That's my point. I would like to suggest that we eschew the term optical illusion, because I want to suggest that at least we think about for this weekend that all of our perceptions are of the nature of so-called optical illusions. Many people, many writers, or at least some, I guess not many, have defined culture as a shared hallucination. And I'd like to suggest that we entertain that notion as part of what we're into this weekend. We're here to examine our own immersion in a particular culture, and specifically as we as individuals respond within that culture. So I think it would be very healthy for us for the next couple days to forget about what does optical illusion suggest? Well, it suggests that we could reach a point where we can obviate that illusion and see it, the naked it, the real thing. I know what's really going on before I was fooled. We do that historically, culturally, all the time. Up on the board, I have a statement which you might want to jot down if you're jotting things down. It's always a good idea to jot down. You know, when the brain makes the muscles move, but whenever the muscles move, there's a return signal to the brain. Mission accomplished. And this feedback alters brain structure ever so subtly, given one movement, but for an accumulation of movements in the shapes of letters, words, and so forth, apparently this feedback can have some more than subtle effects on brain structure. So that's perhaps an over-convoluted justification for taking notes, but there it is. And I want to stress that distinction between general semantics as a system, the set of formulations, originally the formulations of Alfred Korzybski, with some additions and modifications by some people who have worked with Korzybski or who have derived their work from his work. And we also define general semantics as a method. And this, I suppose, is one of the things that most sharply distinguishes general semantics from philosophies, things of that sort. We're very much concerned with not just making formulations, what we feel are more descriptive or more realistic descriptions of so-called reality, whatever that may be, but we also insist that these formulations have applicability to our daily functioning. So, and of course it's precisely this method character or methodology aspect of general semantics that may have stimulated some of the shy reactions of traditional philosophers, thinkers in universities, and so forth. I would like that to be kind of a leitmotif that goes through our 2 days together now. We'll be concerned with presenting the formulations, but we will both be concerned with trying to answer, at least somewhat for ourselves, the question, well, what do I do with this? How do I apply it? I will make some suggestions about that, but I suggest that that's primarily your responsibility. I don't know enough about you as individuals to tell you across the board how you can apply each of these formulations in detail. But as we concentrate on the formulations, and if you internalize those, we suggest that you will find all kinds of applications in your own daily functioning. We're going to talk about facts and inferences with relation to the exercise we did last night, and Jim Sutherland was kind enough to bring in a Blondie strip, which I will read to you just like Fiorello LaGuardia, but with a different accent. It shows Dagwood and Blondie in bed, and Blondie says, "Ed Truffles ran away with that school teacher." And Dagwood says, "It wasn't Ed, it was his brother Ted." And Dagwood further says, "And he didn't run away with a school teacher, she was a seamstress." And Blondie replies, "Who cares about the details, as long as I have the facts?" Okay? And of course, that's the wonderful thing about comic strips, is that these guys who do it seem to be right at that fine line between fact and inference, and they seem to have a great intuitive awareness of some of the things that we talk about in general semantics. And that's why I guess that most of the people that I know who are interested in general semantics spend a lot of their time reading comic strips. And I think that's a very healthy state of affairs. Yesterday we participated in an exercise, and we found that many of us were reading something, we were getting information, and on the basis of the information we had, we reached some conclusions, which is fine, but we, without realizing it, apparently, confused our own conclusions with the factual data. We gave our interpretations, our inferences about what we read, the same value as the factual data that had been presented. And we want to talk about that because that confusion of those two levels of abstracting. We'll talk about the structural differential later, but for now we can simply say we can assign the descriptive factual statements that we had as the little stories to this level, and the inferences that we were drawing from that information to this level. And the problem is not that we confused that we made the inferences, but that we confused the two levels. So let's talk about that a little bit. I want to present the sort of negative definition of what we might accept as a statement of fact. So we'll be concerned with two kinds of statements. Statements of fact and statements that constitute inferences. Now, when we start talking about what constitutes a fact, we get immediately into very, very hairy, can we say hairy water? Why not? Sometimes it happens in the bathtub. We get right into the middle of what's called epistemology, and I suppose that most people here who have read some general semantics and are interested in this area have a ready awareness of what we mean by epistemology. But let's make sure. Does anybody like to suggest a nice, handy, short definition of epistemology or indication of what you understand by that term? Yeah, Evan?
How we know what we know.
Okay, fine. The study of how we know what we know. Good. There's no need to be more complex about that. But we should realize that what is so easy to say is not so easy to find out, is it? If we're going to pursue an epistemological search or investigation, we necessarily have to get into neurophysiology, or what's now called neurobiology, physics, all the natural sciences, excepting perhaps botany and a few things like that. But in the process, we might learn something about how we learn what we think we know about botany. So there are many, many complexities involved in this study of how we know what we say we know. So I want to stress that because in the time that we will talk about this, I'm going to be very superficial. However, I do think that in a negative sense, what I say will hold up in any circumstance. Any. Legitimate all. Well, we'll see about that. I would like to suggest that before you accept any statement as a statement of fact, at least in serious matters, something that really is going to make a difference to you, that you should require two things. One is that the statement be about something observed. Now, if we're going to have a statement about something observed, does that suggest anything to anyone about so-called time? Let's call it space-time. Well, think in terms of your English classes when you were in high school and, well, probably didn't get much of that in college, unless you took a remedial course. Tense, that sort of thing. What would be the space-time issues here? Yes? Dated? Yeah. All right, well, and in a very general sense, that if we're going to make a statement about something observed, it has to be either a statement about a past event or what? Present. Sure, we can make observations about ongoing events. Are there any other possibilities? Or shall I say, are there any other probabilities? Well, I think not, and I want to make that very clear. Some of you may think otherwise. After all, I'm from the East Coast, and I have the bias that the rest of the country shares about California. And I, and I figure, well, maybe in this group there just may be some people who insist that they can observe events which have not yet occurred. You know. All right, so there are lots of reports of that sort, but I am taking the position that events which have not yet occurred cannot be observed and are therefore not available to factual evaluation. Okay? So no statements of fact about future events. Now let's make sure at least you clearly understand my position. You may not agree with it, but it's very important that we share some sharp understanding about that. Is it a fact that this meeting will end at 12 o'clock noon? No. Okay. It hasn't happened yet. I may be about 45 minutes away from my first major stroke. I take it as a likelihood that I've already had a few minor ones. At least some of my behavior suggests that to me. It was while I'm walking around, where am I? You know, what is the evaluation of it all? All right. The major one may occur within 45 minutes, counting, and in that case, of course, will end much sooner than I anticipated. Or, I don't know, maybe you'll stay here until 12 noon and watch the corpus in delight. Corpus delightus. Is it a fact that the sun will rise tomorrow morning? Well, we know, of course, the sun doesn't rise, right? The sun and the earth change position with relation to each other, which we experience as what we call sunrise, because we all still believe the earth is flat, don't we? I was flying here yesterday, and I looked out the window and I said, it is a flat disk. I looked all around. I even went to the other side of the airplane. I excused myself, of course. And there's a big circle, and the damn thing's flat. Now, the astronauts told me that if you get up high enough, you can see curvature and all that, but I couldn't see any. So I still believe in sunrise, even though I know, as someone interested in science and so forth, that doesn't happen. But that event that we call sunrise, is it a fact that it will happen tomorrow morning?
No.
Why not? Hasn't happened yet. Simple as that. It hasn't happened yet. And if we're going to limit...
I'll bet on it.
Oh, sure. Sure. I may go to Las Vegas in December for other reasons. You know. But we want to distinguish between the probabilities and degrees of probabilities. I'll just put a little zero there. Degrees of probability and those things that we have already occurred and that we can know. Now, is this going to guarantee that if we make an observation, that the observation is going to be unrelievedly correct and useful? No. People can hallucinate together. Some of the best marriages I know are what are described as folie à deux, you know? The madness of two. And perhaps that's necessary to have a really good working relationship. You have to share this intimate madness. And now, please turn the cassette over for the start of side B. All right, so future events can be evaluated with relation to degrees of probability. Now here's where your wisdom comes into play. I think that event that we call sunrise is surely going to happen tomorrow morning, and I would bet on it too, as much as I could muster. In fact, I'd probably even bet some money I don't have, because if it doesn't rise, it won't matter anyway. It's a no-lose bet, isn't it? Okay. Sometimes the probabilities are so high, or we evaluate them as so high, that we can, practically speaking, accept what's only a probability as pretty certain. But therein lies a trap. And if we tend to do this sort of thing as a matter of habit, as part of our orientation, our habitual patterns of evaluation, of course this is where a lot of difficulties can come into play. some of the answers that some of you gave yesterday about murder and robbery, the probabilities were pretty good, wasn't it? You were reading that, and with the various events being described there, it was not unreasonable to conclude that someone had been murdered. That's a very entertainable hypothesis, but only at that point a hypothesis, not some kind of fairly definite event that you could evaluate as a fact. Okay, so again, negative. I'm simply saying if you don't have these two requirements, oh, wait a minute, I didn't put the second requirement yet. Did you notice that? If you haven't had coffee yet, you may not have noticed it. But I've had some coffee, so I noticed it. The second requirement is that it be public. And by that, I simply mean that more than one brain is involved in the observation. Now, that doesn't mean that somebody can't have a private observation, which is quite correct. But I am suggesting that for very important issues, private observations are not sufficient. If it's something that really matters to me, that relates in some way to my survival or to my having a successful meeting, if I'm a business person or whatever the circumstance may be, I'm not going to be satisfied with a private report. I want to know, well, who else saw it? And of course, this is called verification. I want to stress that this does not eliminate the uncertainties that are at the heart of all observation, for reasons that we will stress later on. But it gives us a fairly secure negative model that we can apply to any statement. Now, by an inference, we can simply mean any statement let's say that goes beyond the facts. In other words, any statement that asserts more than we have been able to directly observe, past or present. It may go just a little bit beyond. The fact is that I just burped. Is it a fact that that burp was caused by my second cup of coffee? I don't know. I may have just swallowed too much air on the way over here. That's a very insignificant inference about the source or the reason for the burping. So it constitutes an inference. It's not a statement of fact. I'd like to give you a series of statements which I borrowed out of a book by Stuart Chase a long time ago. Not The Tyranny of Words, but a later book. Yes?
Why do you keep referring to those as negative indicators? Why not positive indicators?
Do you have a problem with the word negative?
You used it. I'm trying
Yes.
to find out why you used it.
Okay. I'm using it because I'm saying that this does not guarantee. I'm not saying that if you have this, you definitely are dealing with something that's factual. All right? I'm simply saying that if you don't have these, and this is the sense which I'm saying it's a negative model, if you don't have these two requirements, then you can be pretty sure that you're not dealing with a statement of fact. And I'm suggesting that that's very secure, that negative approach to it. You know, Korzybski used to make a big deal about the security of negative statements. Now, the reason he felt that negative statements were secure is that they avoid or very strongly deny the ears of identity. Positive statements in our usual speaking patterns are almost unrelievedly examples of the use of identity, the confusing of orders of abstracting. A negative statement denies that identity, and thereby, from Korzybski's point of view, gives us more security. So I'm sort of operating from that point of view here. If you have these, maybe you have really factual data and maybe you don't. All right? You've increased your chances. But if you don't have this, then I'm saying you better back off and get some more information before you accept the statement as factual. Okay? Fine. Any other comments or questions about that? Remember, this is not a belief system, and although particularly today, this morning, I'm going to be doing a lot of babbling to earn my fee, that doesn't mean that you should just sit there and swallow this stuff whole. If you have any discomfort or questions about anything that I'm saying, please do what he just did.
He rang a bell that went on with me.
Good.
In times past, and I think I feel the need to say that I heard him using negative as related to positive, and we're using negative as related to affirmative in that context.
All right.
Instead of making an assertion, Korzybski would say what something wasn't.
Yeah, and he's saying that negative assertion is more secure
Right.
than almost any affirmative assertion that we might make. But here again, this is a good example of the kind of undertow effect of language habits that Korzybski and Lee and Johnson and those people were talking about. Is that just using terms like negative and positive. I've had people over and over again say, well, gee whiz, can't you use another word other than negative? Because that sounds so, well, negative. And apparently for many of us, we have an over-restricted response to the term negative, as though negative is bad and positive is good. Well, nonsense. After all, if negative is bad, we couldn't have all of the electronic gear that we're working with. You couldn't have had all the electric technology until the algebraists came up with the negative number. Without that, you can't even talk about electronic systems. So negative must be very good in some circumstances, yes.
Those are also necessary. Those two could be seen as necessary conditions. They're not sufficient conditions for a fact, and we could never come up with all the sufficient conditions.
Probably not. Good. Do you hear that? The distinction between necessary and sufficient. It's an old-fashioned Aristotelian distinction, but very useful. Remember, we're not Aristotelian, not anti-Aristotelian. Russ is suggesting that these requirements are necessary before you should accept something as a statement of fact, but they're not sufficient to guarantee that the statement accepted as factual is going to be unrelievedly certain. Okay, is that relatively non-opaque? No? All right, how are you hearing me in the back? Okay? Okay. I was going to ask if there's anyone who does not hear me, but I guess they wouldn't be able to answer the question. So, it's a problem. All right, let me give you the 4 sentences. I won't put them on the board to save a little bit of time, but I'd like you to write them down. And we'll see how quickly we can move from descriptive, factual type statements to inferences of various orders. The first statement, this train is going at 20 miles an hour. This train is going at 20 miles an hour. Now let's just set up the conditions. Let's assert that the speedometer is working correctly, and perhaps that this train has been checked with radar and various other ways of checking speeds. Would you say that that's a factual type statement? Okay. At least it meets these 2 negative requirements, doesn't it? We could observe it. It's an ongoing event. And we could get verification. We could bring somebody else into the cab and say, well, look at the needle. Now, of course, we recognize, let's not be too simple-minded, the needle also constitutes a kind of inference, doesn't it? The needle is determined by the motions of the wheels and the state of the molecules of that wheel and all kinds of hookups. And in observing that at a descriptive, factual level, we, of course, are making the assumption, we're making the inference that the speedometer is working correctly and is giving a fair indication of the speed. So the subtleties are still there. We can't avoid them. But for practical purposes, we say, yeah, that's what we mean by 20 miles an hour, what shows up on that needle. So it's a fact We could be even more secure, I guess, if we said the needle is pointing to 20. And that we could probably eliminate a lot of dispute right then and there. So let's accept that as a factual type statement. The second sentence, at this rate, will be an hour late. At this rate, will be an hour late. Now we could make that even more formal, in a sort of mathematical way. We would say, if these conditions remain constant, we will be an hour late. Fact or inference? Fine. Anybody not happy with that? Sometimes there's a mathematician in the group who will say, oh no, that's certain. You have posited these conditions, and if these conditions remain constant, this conclusion is inescapable. And that's quite correct, isn't it? In the formulations. But we don't know what's happening on the track. All right? So that would be an inference. Now, it's a pretty secure inference, isn't it? Nothing terribly pathological about that. It seems like a pretty good bet, as our Las Vegas fellow likes to say here. Okay? The king of Las Vegas we have. Fine. Third statement. Yes?
I don't quite understand why that's the second statement is an inference.
Okay. Can anybody help?
In the future,
Don't tell him. Tell him. Go ahead.
Because it'll be in the future.
Sure.
We're assuming it's going to.
Okay. It's a statement about an event which has not yet occurred.
But you're saying at this rate.
Yes, at this rate.
You don't know what's going to occur in the next hour.
At this,
But you won't keep that rate if something occurs. Different.
But at this rate, now,
Aha.
what's going to happen?
a crash could occur.
yeah.
But you're saying if this rate continues, you'll be an hour late. And you know what time you're supposed to be there.
Oh, well, let's say if we continue. We say if all of these conditions remain in place, we'll be an hour late.
Unless they switch to another track.
Yeah. Well, unless the conditions are not met.
No,
But-
no condition here is staying on the same track in the direction you're going.
Well, let's nail this right down. See, this is so simple. That's Kaczynski's say, baby stuff. Like hell it is. Not simple at all. Let's really nail it down and to fit it right into your forehead, all right? Let's say conditions are not going to change. Everything that we've described is going to remain constant. There will be not the slightest variation, there will not be the slightest variation in speed. Ergo, at this rate, we will be an hour late. Fact or inference?
It's like saying the sun's gonna rise tomorrow.
Okay. It's a future-oriented
No,
event.
It's not like saying the sun's going to rise. It's saying if the sun rises, something will happen.
No, we're saying if things happen as they have happened as far as we know up till this morning, the sun will rise tomorrow morning. All right? But we're saying that is not a statement of fact.
Because you don't know that the rate will.
Sure. It's an inference of the predictive type. It's future-oriented. I don't care how little time we're dealing with. If it's future-oriented, we're making an inference. Okay? Very secure, but an inference. And I'm glad you brought this up, because this, very often will sort of give ready, almost superficial assent to what we just did, but we don't behave that way. We do indeed, or see, is my observation, that most of us, much of the time, go around accepting our inferences of various degrees as established fact.
You said it another way, if this rate continues.
Well, I thought that's the way I said that. But that's fine. One time I was teaching a course for the University of Maryland. It was a college prep course for military people who were going to be discharged within 6 months or thereabouts. And I was doing all the language stuff, this kind of language stuff. And there was a young mathematician who had just gotten his doctorate after maybe about 8 years or so of mathematizing. of speaking almost nothing but mathematics or mathematics. And as sometimes happens with these courses, some of the troops got excited, didn't attack their COs or anything, but they were thinking about some of this stuff. And as the mathematician was laying stuff out ex cathedra, some of them started questioning some of these things, and the mathematicians said, what the hell is happening to these guys? They were so docile before. They said, this is all true. The mathematics is true. So he came to me and he said, what's happening? What are you doing? So I showed him the little Haney exercise that we did, and we talked about that, and I mentioned this example, and on this second statement he said, oh no! That's certain. That's absolutely certain. 45 minutes later, I had still not been able to get through to him that the certainty is strictly in the formulations. Verbal certainty. If we could consider mathematics as a bunch of statements within this box, a lot of mathematicians get in the box. Rudolf Carnap started to believe in his own transfinite numbers as real events. And he had real serious problems. I believe did he not? I don't know if he abacused himself to death or what, but which would be, of course, appropriate, but he did himself in. An artist may fall in love with his model and still remain healthy, but the rest of us may not. If we start with a proposition, we could say that all of the propositions that follow, we could evaluate them as being valid or invalid with relation to our initial propositions. But if we want to know if the statement is true, we have to get outside the statements, outside the system, to this part of the so-called reality, the nonverbal, silent level. And the statement about the train's arrival time cannot be evaluated as true, although it's valid, isn't it? If this is the case, then this will follow. That's valid, but we don't know if it's true, and therefore a fact, until we arrive at the station and check our watches. Let's let that serve as a model. If we could just get that shift, I personally think that most problems in communicating with each other center right in here. We're going to see that there, of course, a lot of problems in this transition from here to here, but as we speak, the focal point of difficulty seems to be primarily the subtle shift that we make from descriptive or factual statements to inferences. And if I'm making an inference and I treat it as a fact, you may have well made a different inference, which you may be treating as a fact, and if we're both doing that, the chances of our finding out what we're up to and maybe coming to some kind of agreement are zilch, or approach zilch, asymptotically.
Are you talking about communication trying to get a point across, or just social talking?
Yes.
Which both? Because no, but the reason I ask that is because sometimes social talking falls within that category of the illusion, that it's all, it's more enjoyable within the framework of the illusion, and that.
This is what we call phatic communion, where we're just sort of talking to be together, and we, through these words, what we're really saying is, I dig you, and it's pleasant to be here, and all that sort of thing. Well, I would suggest that if you are aware, of course, if you're aware that you're involved in phatic communion, you may suddenly leap out of it. I don't know. But if you're in a situation where the function of the words is primarily to sort of be patting each other and just getting along and all that, then fine, do that. Goes well with wine and cheese and good stuff like that. All right. But if you're in the mode, the peculiarly human mode, where you want to evaluate your own statements, you want to be conscious of abstracting, then it seems to me this model is extremely useful and quite important, I think. This railroad is no damned good. Now let's admit it. Probably within the last week you were in some kind of conversation with someone and somebody said something like that, and you said, true. Right on, sister, or brother, or whatever. Which shows the absence of magic in general semantics. I often do that. I think I hear myself doing that. Somebody says something that I happen to agree with. I say, that's true. We share a bias. All right, fact or inference? Inference, sure. A father is taking his son on a train for the son's first train ride, and the word comes through from the engineer, at this rate we'll be an hour late. The father says this railroad is no damn good. The son is delighted because he has an extra hour to go around and annoy the other passengers. To him it's a terrific railroad. Best he's ever experienced. All right, the fourth statement, people ought to boycott this railroad. People ought to boycott this railroad. Fact or inference? Okay. We see an example here of what we might call inferential escalation. And it happens so quickly and so easily. Last night I had shared a delightful dinner with some of the folks here. And in thinking back on that, we had a lot of jokes and we were laughing a good bit and little things were being observed. And it occurred to me that I think probably 98% of the statements that we made to each other were inferences. And that the humor precisely derived from the degrees to which we shared the inference which constituted the joke. So that's not bad, is it? This is not an anti-inference lecture. Can you not make inferences? Could you stop? You know, Krzyzewski used to say we sit on our assumptions. What assumption are you sitting on? Anybody? You have any idea of what assumption you're sitting on?
That the chair will continue to support us.
Sure. That the chair will continue to support you. It's a very important assumption, isn't it? How do you feel fairly comfortable right now? You know, not too terribly insecure, depending, on what you brought in here with you this morning. Suppose that you change that assumption. Would that make a difference in your behavior? Sure, I would hope so. All right, so the inferences are tremendously important. The ones that we make habitually, that constitute our underlying system of assumptions, our Weltanschauung, as the Germans like to say, our worldview, are very, very hard to come in contact with, to become aware of. And that's one of the things that developing consciousness of abstracting, we say, can help you to do. Become more aware of the basic assumptions upon which you base your behavior and the things that you do on a day-to-day basis. Let's, those last two inferences, let's call that third statement a value judgment. You've all heard that expression, I'm sure. Should this be spelled with an E? Where? Hmm? Ah, it's wonderful language. In what part of the world? In your part. Okay. Suppose we shift to England. It could be either way. But I'll tell you what I do. Every time I edit the General Semantics Bulletin, and every time that word comes up, I look it up. And I still haven't gotten it straight. But I don't care. In this context, it doesn't mean a damn thing, does it? All right, value judgment for number 3. The fourth one is technically called a purposive communique or message. Let's say purposive message. And that's the kind of statement where we have not only experienced the inferential escalation, But we're now being very social about it. We not only have reached important conclusions for ourselves, but we want to get other people to go along with us. And of course, this is the level at which inference making can be very productive, very destructive. All we're saying in this seminar, and in general semantics in general, is that we ought to be aware of our own escalation and be prepared to re-examine the inferences with relation to any factual data that we may be able to come in contact with.